Let's say you're trying to grow some juicy triceps. Well, don't be caught doing any of the 3 worst tricep exercises I'm about to go through, but I'm not gonna leave you guys hanging. I'm also gonna give you the best alternatives to those exercises for maximizing triceps growth. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first tricep exercise you should avoid if you want to maximize triceps growth is the dumbbell overhead tricep extension. Now, among beginners, unfortunately, this is probably one of the most popular tricep exercises. It's just very abundantly available on Google, and I don't know why, because there's a lot of issues with this exercise. For one thing, the setup is going to be increasingly difficult as you get stronger and as the dumbbell actually gets heavier. So getting to this overhead position in the first place becomes harder. But more than that, usually you're gonna deal with some sort of range of motion issue on this exercise, either by not going down all the way because the dumbbell is caressing the back of your head, or simply your elbows hurt when you go too low. And at the same time, you can't really fully extend because who's really walking out like this on a dumbbell overhead tricep extension? Thus overall, I think there's just better options even when it comes to free weight variations. I personally would rather do an easy curl bar overhead tricep extension than use a dumbbell, because at least the wrist position is not as bad. And on the topic of wrist positions, because you don't really have a handle on the dumbbell, you're forced to be in this awkward extended wrist position, which is bad. And I'm gonna demonstrate why. And to further demonstrate that awkward wrist position, imagine doing an overhead cable tricep extension, but with your wrist back like this. You're just simply not gonna get as good force transfer from keeping your wrist extended. And that's pretty much what you're gonna be doing on a dumbbell overhead tricep extension for every single rep. So instead of the dumbbell overhead tricep extension, what I'd recommend is a unilateral cable overhead tricep extension done in the katana style fashion, which is just a cooler way to say that you wanna flare your elbows out and raise more in your scapular plane instead of directly in front of your body like this, which FYI here would be known as the sagittal plane. Now, a quick tip on this exercise, you wanna make sure you're maintaining this overhead position and you're not letting your arms drift up and down. Now, something that helps me is instead of thinking of just pushing upwards, so up to the sky, that's not what you should be doing. Instead, think about just extending your elbow outwards diagonally, almost kind of like this, like you're unsheathing a katana, hence the name, katana style. Now, I do recommend doing this exercise unilaterally, so one arm at a time, but if you must do a bilateral variation, that can suffice. However, just keep in mind that the setup is gonna be a lot more difficult doing this katana extension since we gotta do this. And the second exercise is the bench press, or rather should I say, relying on the bench press for developing your triceps. And let me explain. Now, the way I think about performing exercises is that I always only have one target muscle group in mind, regardless of whether it's a compound movement or not. This way, I'm able to cater the movement to best bias whatever target muscle group I have in mind. Now, if it's a compound exercise though, that means that the other muscle groups involved by proxy would be less biased. Now let's take the bench press itself as an example. In this exercise, we're hitting the chest, triceps, as well as the front delts. However, the way I perform this exercise is I'm trying to maximize it for chest growth, meaning I tend to take a wider than shoulder grip, so I'm able to bias more of the chest versus the triceps. I also tend to press from a more retracted scapula position, meaning I'm able to bias more of my chest versus the front delts. Thus, I'm able to bias the chest at the cost of unbiasing the front delts and the triceps. For a compound exercise, you perform the exercise in a way that best biases the muscle by trying to uninvolve the other muscle groups that are involved in that exercise. Now, this is a similar reason why it is more quote-unquote optimal for the side delts to do a unilateral cheat lateral raise with your supporting arm actually supporting something versus trying to rely on your core to stabilize yourself. In that example, you have to ask yourself, are we trying to hit the side delts or are we trying to train our core? Thus, instead of relying on a regular bench press for your triceps growth, I'm gonna give you 2 options. First option is an obvious choice. It's gonna be a close grip bench press. Now, don't take close grip too literally. I actually recommend taking more of like a shoulder width grip. The key thing is that you want your elbows pretty tucked. Now, the pluses for this exercise is it's relatively stable and it should feel pretty familiar because it's essentially a bench press with a closer grip. However, this exercise requires a level of finesse in order to perform it adequately for the triceps while not like putting your elbows or shoulders into a position where you might end up developing some sort of pain, at least anecdotally speaking from my experience. This usually happens when your elbows tend to flare out wider than your wrist, or you tend to go too deep on the close grip bench press. Now enter the second option, which is gonna be a machine triceps dip. Now the easiest way to bias the triceps over the lower chest on this exercise is to keep your elbows a little bit more tucked than you would normally. And I like to also think about elbow extension, so straightening my elbow versus just trying to press this machine down. So that's gonna look something like this. Now, in certain times, taking a neutral grip will even allow you to get even a more tucked elbow position, but in this case, because I'm not really that broad, it's gonna make it a little bit weird when we be pressing like this. So I'm gonna say pronated here. Now you might be thinking, Tyler, if we're trying to bias the triceps, why don't we just do tricep isolation exercises? Well, there's actually value in doing a triceps focused compound exercise because it allows us to bias the lateral and medial head of the triceps. Let me explain. And this all starts with understanding the long head of the triceps, which is this inner part right here. Now, the long head is the only head of the triceps that crosses both the shoulder joint as well as the elbow joint. And because it crosses the shoulder joint, it is able to contract when we bring our arm down into shoulder extension, as well as stretch when we bring our arm up into shoulder flexion. The TLDR for this is when we're doing a press or a dip motion, we are stretching the long head at the shoulder joint because we're coming from down here to up here, right? We're bringing our arm up. But also at the same time, at the elbow joint now, we are contracting or shortening, meaning the long head isn't able to essentially sufficiently stretch or contract in order to meaningfully contribute into the exercise. So instead of going like this and actually, stretching and contracting, doing work, it's going like this. And by proxy, because the lateral and the medial head of the triceps doesn't cross the shoulder joint, it has no effect with whether we're moving our shoulder or not. And because it's not disadvantaged like the long head is, by proxy then, it becomes the one that gets biased. Now, I made a whole video on bioarticular exercises, so if you wanted more in-depth explanation, definitely check out that video. But the TLDR is, think of compound triceps focused exercises as lateral head and medial head focused tricep exercises. Now real quick, if you're thinking, Tyler, all this talks of bioarticular muscles, resistance profile, all this stuff, it's kind of confusing. I just want everything laid out for me, take the guesswork out of getting to my fitness goals, and I highly recommend you apply to my exclusive one-on-one fitness coaching program where I do literally just that. I provide you a custom workout program. I even give you nutrition advice and recipes portioned out to actually fit your overall macros. On top of weekly check-ins, and if you have any questions, you literally can message me at any time. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely check that out in the link in the description. But with that said, let's get back to the video. Third exercise I recommend avoiding is gonna be the dumbbell tricep kickback. Now there's two main issues with this exercise. First off, maintaining this shoulder position to properly execute the movement is a limiting factor in and of itself, but more importantly, the second problem is that there's pretty much no resistance in the more stretched position for the triceps. Now on that first point, the dumbbell tricep kickback essentially forces us to maintain an isometric row position with our rear delts and our back, because basically we have to hold this position over here. Now it's likely the case that your triceps are gonna get fatigued before your back. That's the ideal scenario, but it is inherently a negative on this exercise. In fact, exercises that tend to have a higher stability requirement are usually not the best exercises for maximizing hypertrophy. Another good example would be, for example, a bent over barbell row. It's very hard for a lot of people to maintain that bent over position with proper form. And moving on to that second point, because we're bound by gravity, this exercise pretty much has no resistance when our arm is bent. In fact, the tricep kickback has what's known as an ascending resistance profile, meaning we get more resistance as we get closer to fully straightening our arm, meaning the hardest part is gonna be out here, and it gets way easier in this more stretched region. Now, I'm not even gonna have a debate whether the triceps benefit from stretched medial hypertrophy or not, but this exercise is essentially a shortened partial because of this flaw. And ultimately, there's just plenty of other exercises that have a more even resistance profile, let alone any resistance in the lengthened portion. So instead of the dumbbell tricep kickback, what I recommend if we still want to get our long head of the triceps super shortened from getting that shoulder extension is going to be a unilateral cross-body cable tricep extension. But instead of finishing with our hand in front of our body here, we're simply going to stand up and get a more extended shoulder. So starting from a regular unilateral cross-body cable tricep extension, what we're going to do is stand more up straight, take a small step forward, turn our head to the side of the working arm, pivot our foot to the same side of our working arm, and from here we simply extend with our hands, finishing right just behind the back of our body. Now I recommend keeping your head turned because you don't want the cables grazing your lips. You don't know where these cables have been. All right, and those were the 3 tricep exercises to avoid. Let me know down in the comments if you agree with my list, and hopefully you guys start implementing those alternatives if you guys were doing these exercises before. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Don't forget to leave a like and support my page and hit subscribe, but don't only do that. Make sure to hit the bell because that's pretty much the equivalent of subscribing nowadays. Anyways, I'll see you on the next one. Peace.